Lesson 16, Deep Water. After this lesson you're going to read all about jellyfish, some factual information, and then I would like you to complete a mind map picking out the key points. Alex gave up trying to break free of the chair. His wrists were bruised and bloody where the chain had cut into him. The cuffs were too tight. After 30 minutes Mr. Grin still hadn't come back. He tried to reach the zip cream that Smithers had given him. He knew it would burn through the handcuffs in seconds. And the worst thing was, he could actually feel it, where he had put it in the zipped-up outer pocket of his combat trousers. But although his outstretched fingers were only a few centimetres away, try as he might, he couldn't reach it. It was enough to drive him mad. He had heard the clatter of the helicopter taking off and knew that Herod Sale must be on his way to London. Alex was still reeling from what he had heard. The multimillionaire was completely insane. What he was planning was beyond belief, a mass murder that would destroy Britain for generations to come. Alex tried to imagine what was about to happen. Tens of thousands of schoolchildren would be sitting in their classes, gathered round their new stormbreakers, waiting for the moment, at midday exactly, when the Prime Minister would press his button and bring them online. But instead there would be a hiss, and a small cloud of deadly smallpox vapour would be released into the crowded room. And minutes later, all over the country, the dying would begin. Alex had to close his mind to the thought. It was just too horrible, and yet it was going to happen in just a couple of hours' time. He was the only person who could stop it, and here he was, tied down, unable to move. The door opened. Alex twisted round, expecting to see Mr. Grin, but it was Nadia Vole, who hurried in, closing the door behind her. Her pale round face seemed flushed, and her eyes behind the glasses were afraid. She came over to him. "Alex!" "What do you want?" Alex recoiled away from her as she leaned over him. Then there was a click, and to his astonishment his hands came free. She had unlocked the handcuffs. He stood up, wondering what was going on. "Listen to me," Vole said. The words were tumbling out quickly and softly out of her yellow-painted lips. "We do not have much time. I am here to help you. I worked with your uncle, Ian Ryder." Alex stared at her in surprise. "Yes, I am on the same side as you." "But nobody told me. It was better for you not to know." "But," Alex was confused, "I saw you with the submarine. You knew what Sale was doing." "There was nothing I could do. Not then. It's too hard to explain. We do not have time to argue." "You want me to stop him? No?" "I need to find a phone. All the phones in the house are coded. You cannot use them, but I have a mobile in my office." "Then let's go." Alex was still suspicious. If Nadia Vole had known so much, why hadn't she tried to stop Sale before? On the other hand, she had released him, and Mr. Grin would be back any minute. He had no choice but to trust her. He followed her out of the room, round the corner and up a flight of stairs, to a landing with a statue of a naked woman, some Greek goddess, in the corner. Vole paused for a moment, resting her hand against the statue's arm. "What is it?" Alex asked. "I feel dizzy. You go on. It's the first door on the left." Alex went past her along the landing. Out of the corner of his eye he saw her press down the statue's arm. The arm moved. A lever. By the time he knew he had been tricked, it was too late. He yelled out as the floor underneath him swung round on a hidden pivot. He tried to stop himself falling, but there was nothing he could do. He crashed onto his back and slid down, through the floor and into a dark black plastic tunnel, which corkscrewed beneath him. As he went, he heard Nadia Vole laugh triumphantly, and then he was gone, desperately trying to find a purchase on the sides, wondering what would be at the end of his fall. 5 seconds later he found out. The corkscrew spat him out. He fell briefly through the air and splashed into cold warm water. For a moment he was blinded, fighting for air. Then he rose to the surface and found himself in a huge glass tank filled with water and rocks. That was when he realised, with horror, exactly where he was. Vole had deposited him in the tank with the giant jellyfish. Herod Sale's Portuguese man-of-war. It was a miracle that he hadn't crashed right into it. He could see it in the far corner of the tank, its dreadful tentacles and their hundreds of stinging cells, twisting and spiralling in the water. There was nothing between him and it. Alex fought back the panic, forced to keep himself still. He realised that thrashing about in the water would only create the current that would bring the creature over to him. The jellyfish had no eyes. It didn't know he was there. It couldn't attack. But eventually it would reach him. The tank he was in was huge, at least 10 metres deep and 20 or 30 metres long. The glass rose above the level of the water, far out of his reach. There was no way he could climb out. Looking down through the water, he could see light. He realised he was looking into the room he had just left, Herod Sale's private office. There was movement. Everything was vague and distorted through the rippling water, and the door opened. 2 figures walked in. Alex could barely make them out, but he knew who they were. Fraulein Vole and Mr. Grin. They stood together in front of the tank. Vole was holding what looked like a mobile phone in her hand. "I hope you can hear me, Alex," the German woman's voice rang out from a speaker somewhere above his head. "I'm sure you will have seen by now that there is no way out of the tank. You can tread water, maybe for 1 hour, maybe for 2. Others have lasted for longer. What is the record, Mr. Grin?" Nah. 5.5 hours, yes. But soon you will get tired, Alex. You will drown. Or perhaps it will be fast and you will drift into the embrace of our friend. You see him? No? It's not an embrace to be desired. It will kill you. The pain, I think, will be beyond the imagination of a child. It is a pity, Alex Ryder, that MI6 chose to send you here. They will not be seeing you again. The voice kicked off. Alex kicked in the water, keeping his head above the surface, his eyes fixed on the jellyfish. There was another blurred movement on the other side of the glass. Mr. Grin had left the room, but Vole had stayed behind. She wanted to watch him die. Alex stood up. The tank was lit from above by a series of neon strips, but they were too high to reach. Beneath him he heard a click and a soft whirring sound. Almost at once he became aware that something had changed. The jellyfish was moving. He could see the translucent cone with its dark mauve tip heading towards him. Underneath the creature the tentacles slowly danced. He swallowed water and realised he had opened his mouth to cry out. Vole must have turned on the artificial current. That was what was making the jellyfish move. Desperately he kicked out with his feet, moving away from it, surging through the water on his back. One tentacle floated up and draped itself over his foot. If he hadn't been wearing trainers, he would have been stung. Could the stinging cells penetrate his clothes? Almost certainly. His trainers were the only protection he had. He reached the back corner of the aquarium and paused there, one hand against the glass. He already knew what Vole had said was true. If the jellyfish didn't get him, tiredness would. He had to fight every second to stay afloat, and sheer terror was sapping his strength. The glass, he pushed against it, wondering if he could break it. Perhaps there was a way. He checked the distance between himself and the jellyfish, took a deep breath and dived down to the bottom of the pool. He could see Nadia Vole watching. Although she was a blur to him, he would be crystal clear to her. She didn't move, and Alex realised with despair that she had expected him to do just this. He swam to the rocks and looked for one small enough to bring to the surface, but the rocks were too heavy. He found one about the size of his own head, but it refused to move. Vole hadn't tried to stop him because she knew all the rocks were set in concrete. Alex was running out of breath. He twisted himself round and pushed himself up towards the surface, only seeing at the last second that the jellyfish had somehow drifted above him. He screamed, bubbles erupting out of his mouth. The tentacles were right over his head. Alex contorted his body and managed to stay down. flailing madly with his legs to propel himself sideways. His shoulder slammed into the nearest of the rocks, and he felt the pain shudder through him. Clutching his arm in his hand, he backed into another corner and rose up, gasping for breath, as his head broke through the surface of the water. He couldn't break the glass. He couldn't climb out. He couldn't avoid the touch of the jellyfish forever. Although he had bought all the gadgets Smithers had given him, none of them could help him. And then Alex remembered the cream. He let go of his arm and ran a finger up the side of the aquarium. The tank was a marvel of engineering. Alex had no idea how much pressure the water was exerting on the huge plates of glass, but the whole thing was held together by a framework of iron girders that fitted around the corners on both the inside and outside of the glass. The metal faces held together by rivets. Treading water, he unzipped his pocket and took out the tube, zip clean for healthier skin. If Nadia Vole could see what he was doing, she would think he had gone mad. The jellyfish was drifting towards the back of the aquarium. Alex waited a few moments, then swam forward and dived for a second time. There didn't seem to be very much of the cream given the thickness of the girders and the size of the tank, but Alex remembered the demonstration Smithers had given him. How little he had used. Would the cream even work underwater? There was no point worrying about that now. Alex held the tube against the metal corners at the front of the tank and did his best to squeeze a long line of cream all the way down the length of the metal, using his other hand to rub it in around the rivets. He kicked his feet, propelling himself forward across to the other side. He didn't know how long he would have before the cream took effect, and anyway, Nadia Vole was already aware that something was wrong. Alex saw that she had stood up again and was speaking into a phone, perhaps calling for help. He had used half the tube on one side of the tank. He used the second half on the other. The jellyfish was hovering above him, the tentacles reaching out as if to grab hold of him and stop him. How long had he been underwater? His heart was pounding, and what would happen when the metal broke? He just had time to come up and take one breath before he found out. Even underwater, the cream had burned through the rivets on the inside of the tank. The glass had separated from the girders, and with nothing to hold it back, the huge pressure of water had smashed it open like a door caught in the wind. Alex didn't see what happened. He didn't have time to think. The world spun, and he was thrown forward in helpless as a cork in a waterfall. The next few seconds were a twisting nightmare of rushing water and exploding glass. Alex didn't dare open his eyes. He felt himself being hurled forward, slammed into something, then sucked back again. He was sure he had broken every bone in his body. Now he was underwater. He struggled to find air. His head broke through the surface, but even so, he finally opened his mouth. He was amazed he could actually breathe. The front of the tank had blown off, and thousands of litres of water had cascaded into Herod Sale's office. The water had smashed the furniture and blown the windows out. It was still draining away through the floor. Bruised and dazed, Alex stood up, water curling round his ankles. Where was the jellyfish? He had been lucky that the two of them hadn't become tangled up in the sudden eruption of water, but it could still be close. There might still be enough water in Sale's office to allow it to reach him. Alex backed into a corner of the room, his whole body taut. Then he saw it. Nadia Vole had been less fortunate. She had been standing in front of the glass when the girders broke, and she hadn't been able to get back out of her way in time. She was lying on her back, her legs limp and broken. The Portuguese man-o'-war was all over her. Part of it was sitting on her face, and she seemed to be staring at him through the quivering mass of jelly. Her yellow lips were drawn back in an endless scream. The tentacles were wrapped all around her, hundreds of stinging cells clinging to her arms, legs and chest. Feeling sick, Alex backed away to the door and staggered out into the corridor. An alarm had gone off. He only heard it now, as sound and vision came back to him. The screaming of the siren shook him out of his dazed state. What time was it? almost 11 o'clock. At least his watch was still working. But he was in Cornwall, at least a 5-hour drive from London, and with the alarm sounding, the armed guards and the razor wire, he'd never make it out of the complex. Find a telephone? No. Vole had probably been telling the truth when she said they were blocked. And anyway, how could he get in touch with Alan Blunt or Mrs. Jones at this late stage? They'd already be at the Science Museum. Just 1 hour left. Outside, over the din of the alarm, Alex heard another sound, the splutter and roar of a propeller. He went over to the nearest window and looked out. Sure enough, the cargo plane that had been there when he arrived was preparing to take off. Alex was soaking wet, battered and almost exhausted, but he knew what he had to do. He spun round and began to run. Okay guys, that's the end of this chapter. So you need to do your little bit of work on the factual information about jellyfish that I left you, and then I will see you back tomorrow to read the next chapter.